Welcome to Herbally Yours, an adventure into the world of natural medicine. Here is your host, Dr. Ellen Kamai, the natural nurse who will help you take the leap to ultimate wellness.
Greetings, and thank you for joining me, Ellen Kamai, the natural nurse, for another edition of Herbally Yours, right here on the voice of Nassau Community College, 90.3 WHPC. Listen on air or online at iHeartRadio, Odyssey, TuneIn app, smart speakers, nccradio.org, or on our own app, WHPC app. And we'd like to tell you that we bring you the latest information about the many facets in the world of natural living and have been doing so for many decades. And our guest today is author and Dr. Michael Shea. We're going to be talking about biodynamic osteopathy and craniosacral therapy. Dr. Shea holds a doctorate in somatic psychology from the Union Institute and has taught at the Upledger Institute, which I visited many years ago in California, the Santa Barbara Graduate Institute, and the International University for Professional Studies. He is a founding board member of the Biodynamic Craniosacral Therapy Association of North America and the International Affiliation of Biodynamic Trainings. He is the author of several books, including Somatic Psychology, and lives right near me. He lives in Juno Beach, Florida, and I'm bringing you this show today. Actually, I am in Deerfield Beach, Florida, so we're near each other, but we're all here today at WHPC. And Michael, I'm looking at your new beautiful book, The Biodynamics of the Immune System. So thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you, Ellen. It's a pleasure.
Let's go into how you got onto the path of biodynamic osteopathy. That sounds like a big word. What does all that mean?
Well, actually, just to start the record straight, that I'm not a biodynamic osteopath, but I've studied with a lot of osteopaths, and the word biodynamic itself was coined by an embryologist. So I'm an academic embryologist, and I've studied embryology, and it was an attempt by the osteopathic community in the manual therapy component of the cranial concept to bring more of an embryological perspective into the work, a sense of origin, a sense of originality, and a sense of contacting the actual forces of life that were present at the time of conception and during the embryonic period that are still present in our body today. So a biodynamic osteopath or a biodynamic craniosacral therapy practitioner like myself, we attempt to attune our perception to the life forces that are present in our body, and they're the life forces of health and healing.
And that whole word biodynamic is dynamic. It's like interchanging. It's not like set in stone. So I imagine you yourself, meaning a person, you can actually influence through some actions different dynamic elements of what they came into the world with.
Absolutely. I mean, biodynamic is a specific term regarding an embryological model called dynamic morphology, which is balanced with the epigenetic model. So it's a scientifically based model. But biodynamic actually is defined as the growth of the whole over time. In other words, early embryologists looked under a microscope in the 1930s and 40s at human embryos, and what they were observing as the whole was expanding, as well as the individual parts inside that were developing and differentiating. So development of the whole over time basically means that at every stage of our life that we are in a constant state of basically developing. And there's all sorts of stage theories around development, but biodynamic is very much specifically oriented around embodiment of our senses and being able to feel the life forces in our body so that we can be more discerning about how we manage our lives, our physical lives and our emotional, mental lives, and of course, our spiritual life.
Well, you have beautiful illustrations in your book. The book I'm looking at is, and I know you've written several, but this one is biodynamics of the immune system. And I'm seeing that you have some really beautiful illustrations to help describe what you're talking about and how people can influence their actual physical body through different activities that you talk about in the book.
Absolutely. One of the interesting terms that was coined by the founder of biodynamic osteopathy, Dr. Jim Jellis, he was very clear around this whole notion of the embryo. And he was my first teacher, my embryonic teacher. But the embryo is 98% fluid. It's 98% water. And so the metaphor of the fluid body, which is a term coined by Dr. Jellis, it gives the practitioner an opportunity to sense their body and to actually visualize their body as more oceanic, as more have more potential for flow, more potential for spreading, such as the blood, and just a deep sense of settling into flow, buoyancy, lift, stability, these types of terms that allow us to really become embodied much more and to trust our body. The thrust of the book is about why we've gotten so metabolically unhealthy and how can we return and feel these forces of health within our body. And the forces of health are found within the fluid body, within the context of the fluids. There's enough research right now that says that we're about as an adult, you and I sitting here or standing, are about 92% water. That's pretty amazing. So we can tune into that and feel those forces.
Well, what came to mind, and I just love the illustrations where you're showing that cytoplasm, which is the fluid essence and how it attaches in the beginning. But what came to mind for me is actually something that I've experienced over the years with very often from the Philippines. They have people called psychic healers, and they will scan a body and feel that there's some kind of grouping of cells inside that isn't good. We're not going to say it's cancer. It might be just some little growth of whatever. And I've seen them reach into the body and grab tissue and pull it back out. And it's not that uncommon within that therapeutic model. And how they described it to me was that, well, it's all water anyway. And if you think about a pail of water, they reach into a pail of water. Anyone can do this, grab a rock, let's say, and pull it back out, and the water just closes back up. And that's how they say they're able to do that without causing a wound at the end. They actually reach through, grab something, and come back out. And they say they put themselves in a mindset where they're experiencing that fluidity that you're describing.
Right. That's beautiful, Ellen. I remember many years ago seeing films of these Filipino healers, and it's really remarkable to have a gift like that. And I think many people that are promote healing, and for example, myself, I'm in the manual therapy field. The osteopathic community has many manual therapists. And what I like to say is that we each have our own gift. We each have our own, you could say, our own Filipino healer inside of us. Because if you work long enough and have your hands on, I feel like I have a hands-on ministry, you begin to see inside the human body, and just not like a Filipino healer where you could reach inside and pull things out, although that might be possible, and certainly is for some people. But to see inside the body and then to be able to watch the forces of flow within the fluid body, within the body, and then be able to help that client make an adjustment to improve the flow, so that there's this constant interaction based on being able to see inside the body and also be relatively directive, very subtly, of how these life forces can unblock the fluid body and unblock the flow so that health can flow.
Well, there's so many very interesting discussions that you have in this book, and I'm so happy I was able to get a copy of it. I'm sure that's easy. People can just get it. And the name is Biodynamics and the Immune System, which is certainly two big things. Now, what is the state of health or wellness on the planet in general?
I'm laughing, and I actually shouldn't laugh because it's not good. Now, and when I say not good, I mean physical health and specifically metabolic health. We are in the age of, as one cardiologist that I study said, that the volcano of ill health has erupted. And in 2018, a study at the University of North Carolina came out, 88%. I'll slow that down. 88% of Americans are metabolically unhealthy. A study came out last year that was released by the American Cardiology Association, I believe. 93% of Americans have a metabolically unhealthy heart. So the book tries to approach metabolism and describe it without requiring that we be biochemists, but keep it really simple in terms of how did we get this way? How did we get as a country, and I must say as a planet, because I travel around the world, how did we get this unhealthy? And it's because of our metabolism. And then how can we biodynamically enhance the health that's pre-existing in the body in order to improve our metabolic health?
Well, how can we? That's a good question. And I'm sure that you discuss it also in your book. And that's not a surprising number because as a nurse, we see the vast number of people who are on so many pharmaceuticals that really does not bring them back into a state of health.
Well, that's true. And, sometimes the pharmaceuticals are good and sometimes they're not. Basically, Ellen, when I got out of the military service and back in the early 70s, I was morbidly obese. I had a very, very intense experience in the military. I've got 100% service-related PTSD disability. And my first symptom was metabolic unhealthiness. I became morbidly obese, which is a metabolic condition. And we see that the predominant pattern, especially with deaths from COVID in the last 3 years, was from people that were obese. And so I'm really glad I lost the weight. But it's been a lifelong study of me. So it's It's a very personal journey that I've been through. And so this book is about not so much, how I undid it, but how we all can undo it. And I have to say that in the book, I ask people to consider that the kitchen is the new ER, the new emergency room. And I ask people in the book to consider that the bathroom is the new intensive care unit. If you were ever around an ICU unit, and I've done some hospice work, and you can see that when people are in ICU and they're dying from metabolic syndrome, it's multiple organ failure, and it's not a pretty way to die. And so the end of our metabolism is not pretty if we have an unhealthy metabolism, but we can fix it. Study after study recently has shown, like, in some people with type 2 diabetes, it can be undone with a healthy, real food diet within 14 days. This is the work of Jason Fung, a nephrologist in Toronto, Jason Fung, MD. So we see that many of these metabolic conditions can be undone. My obesity was undone. I began studying naturopathy shortly after I got out of the service. And I ended up losing 100 pounds. How did I do that? I did 40-day water fast. I did a 60-day water fast. And I've done a lot of juice fasting. And I was able to repair my body. In Europe, they have many fasting that were called fasting farms here in the United States. They're all gone now for the most part in the United States. But they still have very, very famous fasting medical clinics in Europe. So it's very important to learn intermittent fasting and time-restricted eating because we're eating ourselves to death. Our forks are killing us basically with the amount of food we're putting in and the frequency with which we're putting in and the quality of the food. And it's the research on processed food is devastating. 70% of Americans are eating processed food, too much processed food. And this creates it's a co-creating factor of many of these metabolic problems.
Well, tell us, a lot of people don't even recognize that. I will speak to clients and they'll say, oh, I eat healthy. What is processed food and what is ultra processed food, which is actually a huge portion of what everybody is consuming? Yeah,
I looked at the literature on this a lot because it's been out there very strongly for 5 years. And I include some of this literature in my book. But basically, processed food is when you break down substances, or you break down grains, for example, and you break them down and then you recombine them with other chemicals and you make Pringles or you make pasta or you make bread or you make any number of things that are ultra processed because they've been taken apart in a factory and then they've been reconfigured for taste. And unfortunately, the configuration activates the addiction centers in the brain. The dopamine centers get activated. This is very well documented by the work of Robert Lustig, MD, at the University of California, San Francisco. He's a world's leading authority. So the processed food usually also includes added sugar. So the processed food is going to be a lot of carbohydrates, very complex carbohydrates with added chemicals all mixed in, not in combinations that the body can even recognize for the most part. And then let's throw in some added sugar. And we know that sugar is just a dose-dependent chemical toxin. And so the book is promoting if the first step could be just stop eating foods that have added sugar, just reduce the sugar. Start reducing the amount of processed food that you're eating, especially ultra processed food. I say stop the Pringles, but I make that as kind of as a joke, as a metaphor. But that's the general idea around processed food.
Well, true. And I think stop the Pringles is actually a very good suggestion. And instead, have something else available like carrot sticks and celery sticks. It's really not that hard to do once you get in your mind that you want to really eat whole foods, not ultra processed food. And not only you, but certainly your children. And I just want to remind our listeners that you are listening to Herbally Yours on the voice of Nassau Community College, 90.3 WHPC. Listen live online at nccradio.org or iHeartRadio or other places. And for more information on today's guest or topic, please send us an email at whpc@ncc.edu. Our guest today is Dr. Michael Shea, and we're talking about biodynamic osteopathy and also his book, The Biodynamics of the Immune System. So thank you so much for being our guest today, Dr. Shea.
Ellen, thank you so much. It's always a pleasure. It's a pleasure talking about health. It's a pleasure talking about the human body. I've been in the business for 40 years, and this is actually my 7th book that's come out. And I really feel that the intention of this book is to try to save lives. I still see clients, and I write these books based on what I'm perceiving is happening with the contemporary clients. So it's not a particular fantasy of mine. I know I've healed myself, with the metabolic conditions I've had. And this is a life-saving book. And I really think it's very important that we begin looking at how to get back into the kitchen. And as Robert Lustig says, how can we begin to eat real food? That's his movement, capital R, real food, and move into a domain where we know how to prepare real food.
It's true. And it's not that hard. If you open my refrigerator, there's not one, or my cabinets, there's not one single thing with a paragraph on it. Nothing. And that's something that I talk about, paragraph-free eating. Nothing with a paragraph on it. So that just means whole food. There's like an avocado, there's an apple, and I prefer organic to go a step further. But even if you don't do organic, how much actual food are people eating? Sometimes it's zero.
Right, exactly. And when you open our our refrigerator. I mean, we do a lot of bone broth because I think people don't realize, yes, okay, I agree, it's about eating real food, but there's a couple of other steps in the process. And one of those steps is that if you have a metabolic condition, it's possible and it's highly likely that you have leaky gut, that there's been a degradation of the epithelial lining of your intestine, leading to a breakdown of the barrier function of the epithelial lining. And it's commonly called leaky gut. That has to be repaired. So the repair work, we do a lot of that type of repair work, and it's called making bone broth. And so you see that you can actually buy bone broth now at Costco and other outlets. And
but still, I want to throw out that you want to read it, because I have bone broth in my freezer right now as well that I made myself. But the thing is, the same thing, even with almond milk or bone broth, you have to read it, because some of them in that ingredient list have lots of junk added in. Well, some don't. It's actually just water and possibly a little salt, which I prefer no salt. So even though it says bone broth on it, or it's in a powder, but it has a big paragraph of additives.
Right. Absolutely. I totally agree with that. That's why we only we don't buy bone broth. We make our own bone broth. We've got 2 kitchens here because we own a duplex, and my wife teaches nutritional coaching, and she teaches the third component. After you're tuned into real food, and then you're tuned into how to repair your gut. And I know some of the listeners here might be vegetarian or vegan, and so the thought of bone broth or eating meat and so forth might not be popular, but there are other ways to repair the gut. There is veggie broth. You can make vegetable broths, but the detoxification component is also exceedingly important, and that's also discussed in my book. So metabolically, it's about the intake, it's about the repair, and then it's about the detoxification processes that are necessary.
That's all true, and it's all important. So knowing that bone broth actually is more available right now, I did find an actual really good one right here in Florida in Publix. And when you read the ingredients, there was just nothing else in it. And you threw out Costco, giving them a heads up. So there are, because some people just find it too overwhelming to think about preparing their own, even though it's really super easy. But that is a good start. And in terms of if someone is a vegan, or especially totally vegan, they have their own list of health issues. And being a health care provider since 1964, and I know you've been doing it for a long time as well, especially long-term strict raw food vegans come up with their own whole plethora of health issues that I really do think is often linked to decreased amino acid intake. But it depends on the individual. If that's your like a religious component that you're so set on, then we'll work around it. Yeah. But if you're doing it for health reasons, I think it's a mistake.
Well, it's interesting you say that, because just last week I read a research report through Medscape that there's a higher incidence of depression among vegetarians and vegans. So, and now they're trying to find out why that is. Is it the combination of the things that they're eating, or is there another factor associated, with that depression? But I think what I promote, or what I talk about in the book, is this whole issue of diet and nutrition is really about trial and error. What was working for me in my 20s when I lost all that weight, really wouldn't work for me right now. 40-day water fast would not be good for me at the age of 75. So I can do a 3-day water fast, or I can do other types of fasting. Again, Jason Fung is one of the world's leading authorities on intermittent fasting. So I follow his advice on fasting, and I like to do quarterly a 3-day fast, and just really stay vegan actually for 3 days. Just decrease the meat, really just stay very, very simple for 3 days. But it also includes enemas and colon hydrotherapy. And my wife is an expert with the colon hydrotherapy. She's certified by Dr. Thomas Rau, the Swiss biological medicine doctor. We both teach in his clinic in Switzerland. And as part of his program with the medical clinics that he sets up worldwide, is to have detoxification through colon hydrotherapy. And we're lucky, Ellen, because here in the state of Florida, it's the only state where it's really licensed and legal. It's legal elsewhere, but it's been licensed and legal since 1943 here. So both my wife and I are colon hydrotherapists by profession as well.
Yes, we did that for many years. Actually, even in New York, they had their own rules. You had to be a nurse to apply it, and you had to work under a doctor. And we'd even get them to write a prescription for colon stasis. And then the entire process was actually covered by health insurance. So it's popular in many places. It goes sort of in and out of popularity over the years. But, what a fabulous way to do a detox, and you feel it immediately. So it's great that you're actually running a clinic like that.
Oh, yeah. And that's why I say the bathroom is the new ICU, the new intensive care unit, because if you can't get to a colon hydrotherapist, there's plenty here in Florida. And actually, my wife has a list of, I think it's the International Colon Hydrotherapy Institute, but they have a national organization, and they actually run the certification now here in the state of Florida. But nonetheless, if you can't take a colonic, you can start using enemas, and I highly recommend that.
And there are specific ways to do that as well. So I want to thank you so much for being our guest today, Dr. Shea. And I want people to know you have wonderful books available. Probably one of the best ways to go to find you is at Sheaheart, SHEAHEART.com. And by the way, we will have that as a live link on our archive, so people can always check in with you. Wonderful amount of wisdom. You've been doing this so many years, both for yourself and your clients. So, you really know what you're talking about. And I'm sure many people have found their way to much better health by listening to your suggestions. So thank you so much for being our guest today.
My pleasure.
Right here on Herbally Yours.
Thank you, Ellen.
And thank you, listeners, for tuning in to Herbally Yours, produced right here in the studios at 90.3 WHPC, Nassau Community College, Garden City, New York. For further information, email us at whpc@ncc.edu. This is your host, Ellen Kamai at naturalnurse.com, inviting you to join us next week for another edition of Herbally Yours. Until then, stay healthy.